In 1978, journalist Georgina Dufoix was preparing to board a flight from Lyon to Paris. Nothing about that day suggested catastrophe. No strange weather. No visible mechanical failure. No cinematic premonition. Just another ordinary movement through an airport terminal, another routine decision made by thousands of anonymous people every day. But at the last moment, she changed her mind. Not because of logic. Not because of evidence. Just a feeling she could not explain. A small internal resistance. A discomfort that whispered, "Not this one." She walked away. Minutes later, Air France Flight 286 crashed shortly after takeoff, killing everyone on board. Stories like this spread fast because they activate something ancient inside the human mind. They seem to confirm a seductive belief. Fear is protection. Anxiety is intuition. Discomfort is wisdom speaking before reason catches up. And once that belief enters your nervous system, everything changes. The meeting you postpone suddenly feels like danger avoided. The call you never make becomes proof that hesitation saved you from humiliation. The message left unsent begins to feel less like avoidance and more like survival. Your brain does not care whether the threat was real. It only records one thing. You escaped discomfort and nothing bad happened after. That tiny relief becomes data. And from that moment on, a dangerous lesson is being written beneath your awareness. Maybe retreat is intelligence. Maybe withdrawal is safety. Maybe shrinking is how you stay alive. What begins as one harmless act of avoidance can slowly become an invisible operating system, silently reorganizing your entire life around what you no longer dare to face. Not because the world became more dangerous, but because your mind started rewarding escape. There is a dangerous misunderstanding hiding inside almost every anxious mind. Most people assume fear grows when life becomes harder, when risks multiply, when uncertainty increases. But that is often not what happens. Fear frequently grows in the opposite direction. Not through confrontation, but through absence. Not because you faced too much, but because you gradually stopped facing anything at all. A person does not wake up one morning terrified of speaking honestly, making decisions, being rejected, or being seen. Those fears rarely arrive fully formed. They are usually built slowly, layer by layer, through a series of tiny escapes so rational they barely register. You delay one uncomfortable conversation, then another. You avoid sending one message because the timing feels wrong, then another because you are tired, then another because now too much time has passed. At every stage, avoidance feels harmless, strategic even, but your nervous system is not evaluating your excuses. It is running a simpler equation. Discomfort appeared. You escaped. Relief followed. Lesson learned. This is how a prison is constructed without walls. Not with trauma alone, not with catastrophe, not with dramatic collapse, but with hundreds of microscopic retreats that train your biology to associate discomfort with threat and retreat with survival. And the cruelest part is that from the inside, it does not feel like surrender. It feels responsible. It feels intelligent. It feels like you are protecting yourself. Meanwhile, your radius of freedom quietly contracts. Your future becomes shaped less by desire and more by avoidance patterns you barely notice. One day, you look around and realize your life is no longer organized around what matters to you. It is organized around what you are trying not to feel. What makes this mechanism so destructive is not simply that it limits action. It rewrites perception. The more often you escape discomfort, the less accurately you see reality. A conversation begins to look heavier than it is. A decision starts to feel irreversible. A room full of strangers appears more hostile than it actually is. A possible rejection becomes psychologically indistinguishable from genuine danger. You begin living inside predictions, not facts. And those predictions become darker with every retreat. The mind starts manufacturing explanations to justify what the body has already decided. You call it caution, timing, preparation, self-preservation. But beneath all the language, something more primitive is happening. A system designed to protect you is being trained incorrectly. And once that process begins, life starts splitting in two. There is the visible version others see: routines, obligations, small talk, ordinary functioning. And there is the invisible version underneath: the things you no longer attempt, the risks you silently abandoned, the words you rehearse but never say, the opportunities you mentally visit but physically avoid. That hidden life is where erosion happens. Not in dramatic failure, but in accumulated absence. What you are about to understand changes the meaning of discomfort itself. The sensation you have been interpreting as a warning may actually be evidence of a system begging for retraining. Not because fear disappears when ignored, but because something far stranger happens when fear is repeatedly obeyed. Something almost nobody notices until their world has already become smaller than they ever intended. Here is the paradox most people never confront. The behaviors that make you feel safe in the moment can be the exact same behaviors manufacturing the future you are afraid of. Avoid speaking, and your voice becomes less accessible. Avoid rejection, and your tolerance for vulnerability collapses. Avoid uncertainty, and your capacity to make decisions weakens. Avoid embarrassment, and ordinary exposure begins to feel unbearable. The strategy appears protective while functioning like /escena. Escena. Texto. The answer did not begin in philosophy, nor in self-help, nor in the emotional language people now use to explain why they avoid discomfort. It began in a box. In the 1930s, psychologist Burrhus Frederick Skinner began designing what would later become one of the most influential experimental tools in behavioral science: the operant conditioning chamber, commonly known as the Skinner box. Its structure was simple, almost aggressively simple: a confined enclosure, a lever, a light, sometimes a sound, sometimes a mild electric grid on the floor, sometimes food delivered through a mechanism with mechanical precision. No grand drama. No human complexity, just behavior reduced to its skeletal form. An organism enters. An action occurs. A consequence follows. Skinner's obsession was radical for its time. He was less interested in thoughts, feelings, motives, or inner narratives than in something colder and more measurable. What consequences make behavior repeat? Inside these chambers, rats and pigeons became mirrors of a brutal principle. Press a lever, receive food. Behavior increases. Remove reward, behavior weakens. Introduce discomfort, behavior shifts. Allow an escape from discomfort, and something even more powerful happens. The behavior associated with relief begins to strengthen with remarkable speed. Not because the organism understands the system, not because it reasons through outcomes, but because biology is constantly running a primitive algorithm. Action. Consequence, adjustment, repeat. This mechanism is so fundamental that it operates beneath language itself. Before identity, before belief, before personal meaning, long before you explain your choices with sophisticated narratives, your nervous system is already learning from consequences with mechanical indifference. And that should be deeply unsettling. Because if behavior can be shaped so efficiently through reward and relief, then much of what feels like free choice may be less autonomous than you imagine. The most disturbing finding was not that animals could be taught to seek reward. That much seems obvious. What made Skinner's work transformative was something darker. Behavior could become astonishingly resistant to extinction when linked not only to reward, but to relief. This distinction matters more than most people realize. A reward adds something desirable: food, water, comfort. But relief removes something aversive. Pain stops, pressure disappears, tension dissolves. And in many cases, the nervous system appears to value relief with extraordinary intensity. Inside experimental chambers, an unpleasant stimulus could be introduced: a mild shock, an irritating condition, an uncomfortable state. Then an action was made available that reduced or terminated that discomfort. Very quickly, the organism learned. Not abstractly, not philosophically, physiologically. Do this and the bad feeling ends. Repeat. This is called negative reinforcement. Not punishment, not harm, reinforcement. Because the removal of discomfort strengthens the behavior that preceded it. That detail changes everything. The organism is not merely escaping. It is being rewarded for escaping. And once relief becomes attached to a specific action, that action gains psychological gravity. It begins pulling behavior toward itself automatically. The implication is brutally simple. You do not need pleasure to become conditioned. Relief is enough. Sometimes relief is even stronger. This means an organism can become highly committed to behaviors that produce no joy, no growth, no meaningful reward whatsoever, only the temporary disappearance of discomfort. A profoundly primitive contract emerges. I do not need to feel better. I only need to stop feeling this. And under that logic, almost any pattern can begin to crystallize. Not because it improves life, but because it interrupts discomfort for a moment. This is where the experiment stops being about animals and starts becoming uncomfortably human, because the nervous system does not require a laboratory to run the same code. No metal chamber is necessary. Life provides the stimuli automatically. A difficult conversation approaches. Heart rate rises. Muscles tighten. Attention narrows. A message remains unsent. Immediate relief. A social invitation appears. Internal tension activates. Possible judgment. Possible awkwardness. Possible rejection. You decline. Relief. A decision demands commitment. Uncertainty grows intolerable. You postpone. Relief. Each event seems trivial in isolation, even rational. But beneath conscious awareness, something precise is being reinforced. Not confidence. Not resilience. Not tolerance for uncertainty. Escape. Your biology is learning a sequence with extraordinary efficiency. Discomfort appears. Withdrawal removes discomfort. Withdrawal is reinforced. Repeat often enough and avoidance stops feeling like a decision. It begins feeling natural, instinctive, necessary. This is why people often misunderstand their own behavior. They believe they are making thoughtful choices aligned with their needs. But many behaviors are not being selected because they are wise. They are being selected because they are effective at rapidly terminating internal discomfort. And the nervous system loves efficiency, especially when the cost is delayed. You do not feel the long-term price in the moment. You feel relief. That is what makes the mechanism so dangerous. The immediate reward is emotional silence. The delayed cost is invisible learning. A lesson written directly into the architecture of behavior. When discomfort appears, leave. And every repetition deepens the script. The tragedy is not that this process happens. It is that it feels indistinguishable from self-protection while it is happening. No alarm announces the transition. No internal voice says, "You are conditioning yourself to become smaller." The mechanism is silent, elegant, efficient, and almost impossible to detect from inside, because every act of escape produces evidence that appears to validate itself. You avoided the conversation. Nothing exploded. You stayed home. Nothing terrible happened. You delayed the decision. The discomfort disappeared. From the perspective of raw biology, the conclusio, /escena, escena, texto. If behavior can be shaped by relief, then another question becomes unavoidable. How does fear attach itself to things that were never dangerous to begin with? In 1920, at Johns Hopkins University, psychologist John B. Watson and graduate student Rosalie Rayner attempted to answer exactly that. Their subject was an infant approximately 9 months old, identified in the published paper only as Albert B. History would later know him as Little Albert. Before the experiment began, Albert was tested with a series of stimuli. A white laboratory rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, cotton wool, burning newspapers, masks. The child displayed curiosity, calm attention, occasional amusement. Most importantly, no fear response toward the white rat. This detail mattered. The rat was emotionally neutral, not threatening, not aversive, not biologically meaningful, just an object. That neutrality was precisely what Watson wanted. His project was ambitious and deeply unsettling, to demonstrate that emotional reactions, specifically fear, could be artificially conditioned onto previously harmless stimuli. Not inherited, not discovered through direct danger. Installed. The setup was disturbingly simple. Albert was placed in a room with the white rat nearby. Each time he reached toward it or interacted with it, Watson struck a steel bar behind the infant's head using a hammer, producing a sudden loud noise. The sound was intentionally aversive, sharp, violent, startling. Albert reacted as expected. He flinched, cried, displayed distress. Nothing extraordinary there. A loud, unexpected noise naturally activates alarm. But the noise was never the true target. The rat was, because the experiment was not about what frightens a child naturally. It was about whether fear could be transferred, whether emotion could be relocated from one stimulus to another with enough repetition. And if that were possible, then fear was far less rational than most people would like to believe. It did not take long. After repeated pairings of the white rat with the violent metallic sound, something remarkable and deeply troubling occurred. The child changed. Eventually, Albert no longer needed the noise. The rat alone was enough. When presented with the same harmless animal that had previously triggered curiosity, he began to cry, withdraw, and avoid contact. A neutral object had become emotionally contaminated. Not through injury, not through attack, not through experience of actual danger, only through association. This was the crucial finding. The emotional system did not wait for logic. It did not require evidence. It learned faster. The sequence was brutally efficient. Neutral stimulus, aversive event, repetition, fear. And once the association was established, the nervous system no longer responded to what the rat objectively was. It responded to what the rat now predicted: distress, alarm, threat. This distinction changes everything, because the mind is not always reacting to reality itself. It is often reacting to learned meaning attached to reality. What matters is not merely what something is. What matters is what your nervous system has been taught it means. This is how harmless things acquire emotional weight far beyond their objective significance. A room, a conversation, a facial expression, a notification, a word. None of these need to be inherently dangerous. They only need to become linked with enough internal discomfort. And once that link is formed, the body begins responding before thought has a chance to intervene. This is why people often experience fear that feels irrational even to themselves. Not because the fear is random, but because the original learning happened beneath conscious interpretation. But the experiment revealed something even more unsettling than conditioned fear. Fear did not remain contained. It spread. After conditioning, Albert was tested with objects resembling the white rat. A rabbit, a fur coat, cotton wool, a Santa Claus mask with white beard. His fear response generalized. The distress was no longer attached only to one specific stimulus. It began leaking outward into similar forms. This matters because fear rarely stays obedient to its original boundary. Once the nervous system learns a pattern of threat, it often broadens the category. Not just this, anything like this, anything resembling this, anything that might predict this. A single emotional association can begin radiating influence across an entire perceptual network. And from the inside, the expansion feels justified. The organism is not consciously deciding to become more avoidant. Its threat detection system is becoming more inclusive, more sensitive, more conservative. This is biologically efficient and psychologically expensive, because once fear begins generalizing, the world subtly reorganizes itself. What was once one isolated discomfort starts infecting adjacent territory. Not only the original object, but everything carrying its emotional signature. This is how emotional landscapes become distorted, not through one catastrophic event alone, but through spreading associations that quietly convert neutral territory into psychological minefields. The external world remains unchanged, but internally more and more of reality becomes flagged, potentially unsafe, potentially painful, potentially worth avoiding. And once that expansion begins, fear is no longer simply an emotion. It starts becoming a map The unsettling legacy of this experiment is not merely ethical controversy, though history has judged it harshly for obvious reasons. Its deeper significance is psychological. It demonstrated with disturbing clarity how quickly emotional meaning can overwrite objective reality. A child did not need prolonged exposure to danger. He did not need years of evidence. He did not need rational persuasion. A few repeated pairings were enough to alter his relationship with the world. That is the uncomfortable implication. The human nervous system is exquisitely trainable, not only toward skill, adaptation, or resilience, but toward fear, toward hypersensitivity, toward learned alarm. And because this process happens quickly and often outside awareness.
/escena. Escena. Texto.
By this point, a brutal pattern had already emerged. Fear could be learned, rapidly, efficiently, sometimes without direct harm. But one question remained unresolved, and it was perhaps the most disturbing of all. If a fear is irrational, if the feared object is harmless, if no catastrophe actually occurs, why doesn't fear simply disappear on its own? Why do so many anxieties survive long after reality has offered countless chances to disconfirm them? In 1947, psychologist O. Hobart Maurer proposed an answer that would become foundational to modern theories of anxiety. His framework became known as the two-factor theory of avoidance learning. Its logic was deceptively simple. The first factor explained how fear begins. A neutral stimulus becomes associated with something aversive. An object, situation, or context acquires emotional threat value. The organism learns. This predicts discomfort. But this only explains acquisition. It does not explain persistence. Why would fear remain stable or even intensify when actual danger is absent? Maurer's second factor addressed that mystery. Once fear exists, the organism begins avoiding the feared stimulus. And avoidance produces immediate anxiety reduction. Relief. That relief reinforces avoidance behavior. Not because avoidance solved anything, but because it successfully reduced distress in the moment. This was the missing mechanism. Fear does not need external confirmation to survive. It can become self-sustaining. Conditioning creates the alarm. Avoidance maintains it. Together, they form a closed loop, an elegant psychological machine, almost self-perpetuating. The implication was devastating. A person can remain trapped not because their fear is accurate, but because every attempt to escape fear teaches the nervous system to preserve it. The very strategy that feels protective becomes the engine of continuation. The elegance of Maurer's theory lies in how mercilessly it exposes the illusion. Most people assume avoidance weakens fear. Feels logical. Distance from discomfort should reduce emotional intensity. But the opposite often happens. Avoidance removes not only discomfort, it removes corrective information. This is the hidden cost. When a feared situation is avoided, the organism never remains present long enough to discover what would have happened. The feared outcome is never tested, never challenged, never revised. The nervous system receives only one data point. I left, and I survived. From a learning perspective, this is catastrophic, because survival becomes falsely attributed to escape, not to the harmlessness of the situation, not to the exaggeration of fear, but to avoidance itself. A dangerous conclusion is silently encoded. Leaving saved me. This is how avoidance becomes convincing, not philosophically, experientially. Each retreat feels empirically validated. You avoid the interaction. Anxiety drops. Therefore, avoidance seems effective. You leave the room. Relief arrives. Therefore, leaving seems wise. You postpone the decision. Internal tension softens. Therefore, delay feels intelligent. No part of the system asks the crucial question: what if the feared event was never going to happen? That question never gets answered, because avoidance interrupts the experiment before reality can speak. And in that silence, fear remains undefeated. Untested assumptions harden into certainty. Predictions ossify into perceived truth. This is why irrational fears can feel increasingly rational over time. Not because they were proven, but because they were never meaningfully disproven. This is where the structure becomes almost cruelly efficient. Fear creates discomfort. Discomfort motivates escape. Escape produces relief. Relief reinforces escape. And reinforced escape guarantees less contact with the feared situation, which means fewer opportunities for fear to naturally weaken. The loop closes, not metaphorically, functionally. A closed behavioral economy is established. Every component feeds the next. Nothing external is required.
No ongoing trauma. No actual danger. No repeated catastrophe.
The system can maintain itself indefinitely. This is why avoidance often creates a strange paradox. A person may intellectually understand that something is harmless. They may know, logically, that a conversation is survivable, that uncertainty is tolerable, that embarrassment is temporary. And yet the body continues reacting as if survival is genuinely at stake. This contradiction confuses people. They interpret it as personal failure. Why can't I simply act on what I know? Because knowledge is not the same thing as extinction. Insight does not automatically rewrite conditioned learning. The nervous system is not persuaded by reasoning alone. It is shaped by consequences. And as long as avoidance keeps delivering relief, the system continues receiving the exact reinforcement schedule required to preserve the fear. This means a person can become highly educated about their own anxiety while simultaneously strengthening it. Awareness alone is not enough. The machinery is behavioral, mechanical, relentless, and once understood, a deeply uncomfortable realization begins to emerge. Sometimes what feels like emotional management is actually fear maintenance disguised as coping. This is why avoidance does not merely preserve fear. It often strengthens its authority. Each repetition increases familiarity with one response pattern. Retreat. The nervous system becomes more fluent in withdrawal than engagement, more practiced at leaving than remaining, more skilled at escaping than tolerating. And what is rehearsed repeatedly tends to become easier, faster, more automatic. Over time, avoidance requires less conscious deliberation. It begins executing almost preconsciously. A discomfort signal appears, and behavior is already shifting before deliberate thought fully arrives. This is how lives become shaped by invisible training histories, not through one dramatic decision, but through accumulated repetitions of one simple sequence. Alarm, escape, relief, reinforcement, again, again, again. Eventually, what was once optional starts feeling compulsory, not because the external world changed, but because the internal architecture has been reorganized around one governing rule. Reduce discomfort immediately, and once that rule becomes dominant, something profound is lost. The ability to remain present long enough for reality to contradict fear. That absence changes everything, because without contact, there is no revision. Without revision, there is no recalibration. And wit,
/escena. Escena. Texto.
Fear rarely remains loyal to its original target. Once a system begins organizing itself around avoidance, its boundaries often start dissolving. A documented case published by Sigmund Freud in 1909 illustrates this process with disturbing precision. The child was Herbert Graf, later anonymized in psychoanalytic literature as Little Hans. He was 5 years old, living in Vienna, intelligent, verbal, observant. At first, his fear appeared specific. He developed an intense anxiety around horses. Not all animals, not all movement. Horses, particularly those seen pulling carts through the streets. He feared they might bite him or fall down. This detail mattered in Freud's documentation. Hans had reportedly witnessed a horse collapse in the street, an event believed to have contributed to the development of his phobia. Whatever the precise origin, the observable pattern became unmistakable. The child did not merely dislike horses. He became distressed by their presence. Alert, preoccupied, hypervigilant. His attention began orienting around threat detection. Where are the horses? Could one appear? Could it approach? Could something happen? A previously ordinary part of urban life had acquired disproportionate emotional power. The streets of Vienna had not changed. The horses had not changed. But his relationship to the environment had. One category of external reality had been marked.
Danger.
And once a threat marker is installed, perception reorganizes itself accordingly. Attention narrows. Prediction intensifies. Safety calculations begin. This is how fear quietly starts altering architecture. Not necessarily through dramatic collapse, but by changing what a person is willing to approach, and what they begin reorganizing their movements to avoid. The problem did not remain contained to horses. That is what makes the case so psychologically revealing. Over time, Hans' fear began expanding beyond the original trigger. He did not simply avoid direct contact with horses. He began resisting going outside, then resisting certain streets, then displaying anxiety connected to movement through public spaces where horses might be encountered. The feared object had become the center of an enlarging perimeter. The radius of safety was shrinking. This is how fear changes geography, not by physically altering the world, but by redrawing invisible maps inside the mind. Safe, unsafe, allowed, avoided, possible, forbidden. Each expansion feels justified. From the outside, it may appear disproportionate, but from inside the fearful system, every restriction feels protective. If horses are dangerous, then streets containing horses become dangerous. If streets are dangerous, then movement toward streets becomes risky. If movement creates risk, stillness begins feeling safer. The logic is internally coherent and profoundly limiting. One fear starts behaving like dye dropped into water. It spreads, not chaotically, systematically, touching adjacent territory, contaminating connected contexts. One specific threat gradually infects broader behavioral territory. And because the process happens incrementally, it often escapes detection. No dramatic transformation announces itself. Only small adjustments, a route avoided, an outing declined, a hesitation rationalized, until one day, what was once a narrow discomfort has quietly begun dictating the architecture of daily life. Not through force, through accumulation. What makes this progression so dangerous is its invisibility. The system does not feel like it is collapsing. It feels like adaptation. A child avoiding one street appears manageable. Avoiding several seems understandable. Preferring to stay indoors can be rationalized. Every adjustment looks minor when viewed independently. This is the architecture of gradual contraction. Not one massive surrender. Many tiny negotiations. Compromise here, a modification there, a reduction in exposure justified as practical. And because each adjustment reduces immediate distress, the pattern reinforces itself. Restriction becomes rewarded. A narrower world becomes emotionally easier to manage. First, this is the seduction. Smaller territory often feels safer. Fewer unknowns. Less uncertainty. Reduced exposure to triggering conditions. The system experiences temporary stabilization. But the cost is hidden inside the strategy itself. Because every environmental restriction strengthens the implicit message. The world is dangerous enough to require further limitation. This message does not remain abstract. It becomes behavioral law. Act accordingly. Restrict further. Reduce risk. Compress range. This is how fear gains territory without confrontation. Not by defeating you directly, but by convincing you to surrender pieces of your world voluntarily. One piece at a time. Until what once felt like freedom begins existing only in memory. And by then, the system often no longer remembers what it gave up first. Only that expansion feels increasingly impossible. This is why fear is rarely defined only by what terrifies you. Its deeper power lies in what it gradually removes. Routes, experiences, options, spontaneity, mobility, possibility. A phobia is not merely an excess of fear. It is often an architecture of subtraction, a system of invisible edits made to daily life until the edited version begins feeling normal. This is what makes cases like Hans so unsettling. Not simply that a child became afraid, but that the fear began exerting influence far beyond its original source. Its power was no longer located in horses alone. It had migrated into decisions, movements, permissions, behavioral boundaries. That is the real expansion. Fear becomes infrastructure, an organizing principle, a hidden urban planner redesigning the city of your life around what must not be encountered. Street by street, choice by choice, day by day. And because the process is so incremental, many people never identify the true cost until the contraction is already advanced. They simply notice life feels smaller, less flexible, less alive, without clearly understanding why. But what becomes even more dangerous than shrinking territory is what happens after repeated restriction starts changing not only where you go, but what you believe you are capable of entering at all. When fear begins shaping what you believe you can enter, another adaptation quietly appears. Not total avoidance, something more subtle, more socially acceptable, more difficult to detect. You still enter the room, but not fully. You still participate, but strategically. You remain physically present while psychologically defending against imagined catastrophe. In 1995, psychologists David M. Clark and Adrian Wells proposed a cognitive model of social phobia that clarified why many socially anxious individuals remain trapped even while repeatedly exposing themselves to social situations. At first glance, this seems paradoxical. If a person attends conversations, meetings, gatherings, or presentations, why doesn't repeated exposure naturally weaken the fear? Their answer was clinically revealing. Because many anxious individuals do not simply enter feared situations. They enter while deploying what became known as safety behaviors. These are subtle protective strategies designed to reduce perceived social threat. Avoiding eye contact, speaking less, rehearsing sentences mentally before saying them, holding objects tightly, monitoring posture excessively, smiling artificially, keeping interactions brief, positioning oneself near exits, carefully controlling tone, gestures, facial expressions. From the outside, these behaviors may appear harmless, adaptive even, but their psychological function is crucial. They are not neutral habits. They are covert attempts to prevent feared outcomes. Humiliation, judgment, embarrassment, rejection. The person is not merely engaging socially. They are attempting to survive social exposure while minimizing vulnerability. This distinction changes everything, because what looks like participation can actually be avoidance wearing more sophisticated clothing. And once fear learns it can remain hidden behind controlled behaviors, it no longer needs you to escape physically, only psychologically. This is what makes safety behaviors so psychologically deceptive. They often reduce anxiety, at least temporarily, and because they reduce anxiety, they feel effective. This creates immediate reinforcement. Person avoids eye contact, feels slightly less exposed. Relief. They rehearse every sentence before speaking. Reduce chances of verbal mistakes. Relief. They remain quiet. Avoid saying something embarrassing. Relief. Each strategy appears to confirm its own necessity. The logic seems airtight. If anxiety dropped after using the behavior, then surely the behavior helped. But Clark and Wells identified the hidden cost. Safety behaviors interfere with learning. More specifically, they prevent disconfirmation. This matters enormously. If a feared social catastrophe does not occur, the anxious mind has two possible interpretations. Either the feared outcome was unlikely in the first place, or the safety behavior prevented disaster. Under safety behavior conditions, the second interpretation often wins. The person concludes, I survived because I controlled myself carefully enough. Not because the threat was exaggerated. Not because others were less critical than predicted. Not because imperfection was tolerable. But because my defensive system worked. This is the trap. Success is attributed not to reality being safer than expected, but to vigilance, control, self-monitoring, behavioral armor. As a result, the feared belief remains intact, sometimes strengthened, The person exits the situation relieved, but unchanged.
No recalibratio nequers.
No threat revision. No update. The nervous system learns only one lesson. Continue protecting yourself this way. And what appears externally as competence may internally be a dependency structure built entirely around fear management. Clinical studies following Clark and Wells repeatedly supported this pattern. When socially anxious individuals were instructed to drop safety behaviors during social interactions, something important often happened. Anxiety initially increased. This is predictable. The person feels more exposed, more vulnerable, less defended. But when allowed to remain in the interaction without relying on protective rituals, many began discovering something their nervous systems had previously been unable to learn. Catastrophe often did not occur. Or if discomfort did occur, it was survivable. Imperfection was tolerated. Attention from others was less hostile than predicted. Awkwardness did not produce annihilation. This is not a trivial shift. It is structural. Because the learning available in unprotected contact is fundamentally different from the learning available under defensive management. Without safety behaviors, reality becomes legible again. The person can finally test assumptions directly. Am I truly incapable of tolerating this? Will rejection actually destroy me? Do others really scrutinize me this intensely? Questions that safety behaviors never allow to be answered. This is why some forms of coping quietly preserve the very system they seem to manage. Not all adaptation is liberation. Some adaptations are fear's method of remaining in control while appearing helpful. That is what makes them so hard to relinquish. They do not feel like obstacles. They feel like support, like preparation, like prudence. But sometimes the structure holding you together is also the structure preventing you from ever discovering whether you needed it at all. This reveals a particularly cruel psychological irony. A person can spend years believing they are confronting fear, attending events, speaking occasionally, maintaining relationships, participating just enough to appear functional, and still remain deeply governed by the same underlying system. Because external participation alone is not always evidence of genuine exposure. What matters is the internal contract. Am I here to experience reality, or am I here to control risk? That distinction is often invisible to everyone else.
/escena. Escena. Texto.
If fear can remain intact even while a person appears functional, one question becomes unavoidable. What actually teaches the nervous system that something is safe? Not intellectually safe, not theoretically harmless, but biologically non-threatening. The answer is often far less comfortable than people want. Contact, not distant analysis, not reassurance, not strategic preparation. Direct experience maintained long enough for the body to update itself. In 1924, psychologist Mary Cover Jones conducted what later became recognized as one of the earliest successful demonstrations of behavior therapy. Her subject was a young boy named Peter. Peter had a documented fear of rabbits. The fear was observable and immediate. When exposed to the rabbit, he showed clear signs of distress, withdrawal, avoidance, emotional discomfort. At the time, fear conditioning had already been demonstrated experimentally. But a practical question remained largely unanswered. If fear can be learned, can it also be systematically unlearned? Jones approached the problem with a method that was deceptively simple. Not forced confrontation, not overwhelming immersion, not removal of the feared object. Gradual exposure, controlled proximity, repeated contact under tolerable conditions. Peter was first placed at a distance from the rabbit while engaged in another pleasant activity, such as eating. The feared stimulus remained present, but not intolerably close. Over time, the distance was gradually reduced. Step by step, session by session, the rabbit moved nearer. Peter remained. That sequence matters. Not because the fear disappeared instantly. It did not. But because something more important began happening. The body was staying in contact with the feared stimulus without catastrophe following. And this is the type of information avoidance never allows the nervous system to receive. This is where a fundamental misunderstanding often collapses. Many people assume fear decreases because of courage, as if bravery itself dissolves anxiety. But Peter's case suggests something more precise. Fear weakens through new learning, not through emotional heroism, not through waiting to feel ready, not through perfect confidence. The body updates predictions through repeated exposure to reality that contradicts expectation. Prediction:
Rabbit = danger.
observed outcome, rabbit present.
No catastrophe.
Prediction: proximity is intolerable. Observed outcome, proximity tolerated. Prediction: contact must be escaped. Observed outcome, remaining is survivable. This is how recalibration occurs. Not verbally, experientially. The nervous system is less persuaded by what you tell it than by what repeatedly happens while you remain present. That is why gradual exposure matters. It is not punishment. It is information delivery. A feared object or situation is no longer processed exclusively through anticipation. It becomes reprocessed through lived contact. And contact changes the database. The organism begins collecting incompatible evidence. Nothing happened. Still safe. Still here. Again. 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 Over time, what once triggered alarm begins losing predictive authority. Not because memory is erased, but because new associative learning is layered on top of old conditioning. This distinction is essential. The body does not become safe through distance from fear. It becomes safe through learning that contact and survival can coexist. And until that pairing is experienced directly, fear retains the right to remain believable. There is something deeply inconvenient about this principle. The body cannot be negotiated into safety from a distance. It does not grant certainty in advance. It does not say, approach once you feel calm enough. It demands the opposite. Enter first. Learn second. This is precisely why avoidance is so seductive. It offers emotional relief immediately. Exposure offers something slower, often less emotionally rewarding in the beginning. Temporary discomfort, heightened activation, the sensation of vulnerability. And because humans are naturally drawn toward immediate relief, avoidance often feels more intelligent, more compassionate, more efficient. But short-term comfort can be an exceptionally poor teacher. Peter's improvement did not come from convincing himself verbally that rabbits were harmless. It came from accumulated contact under survivable conditions. His nervous system was not reassured. It was retrained. That difference is enormous, because reassurance depends on belief. Retraining depends on experience. Beliefs can remain fragile. Experience changes thresholds. What once seemed intolerable becomes tolerable. What once triggered retreat becomes manageable. Not all at once. Gradually, incrementally, quietly. This is often how real change looks. Not dramatic transformation. Repeated tolerated contact until the extraordinary becomes ordinary. Until the feared object loses its monopoly on attention. Until the system no longer treats proximity as emergency. And yet something even more psychologically uncomfortable remains. Exposure may teach safety, but only if one condition is met. The person must remain long enough for the nervous system to discover what avoidance has been preventing all along. What begins as prediction can eventually become architecture. Not merely a feeling, not an occasional pattern of retreat. An entire system for organizing existence around threat prevention. Few documented lives illustrate this more starkly than Howard Hughes. Industrialist, aviation pioneer, film producer, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men of the 20th century. A man associated publicly with ambition, innovation, technical mastery, and extraordinary reach. His life was defined by scale, massive enterprises, aircraft engineering, Hollywood influence, political leverage, resources seemingly capable of purchasing almost any form of freedom. And yet, in the later years of his life, a very different pattern became increasingly visible. Accounts from staff, biographers, and historical records describe escalating contamination fears and ritualized attempts to avoid germs, dirt, and perceived sources of infection. This was not ordinary cleanliness. It became systematized, behavioral, compulsive. He reportedly demanded elaborate handling procedures for objects, instructions regarding touch, packaging, food, utensils, surfaces. Layers of control multiplied. The external world began undergoing filtration. Contact became increasingly regulated, restricted, managed. The logic, at least initially, is easy to understand. If contamination is dangerous, then reducing contamination exposure appears rational, protective, responsible. But this is often how life restructuring begins. Not through irrationality that feels absurd, but through threat calculations that feel increasingly justified. One precaution, then another, until behavior is no longer organized around living, but around preventing contact with what has been designated as intolerable. As avoidance intensifies, freedom often disappears under the disguise of optimization. This is one of fear's most sophisticated transformations. Restriction rarely announces itself as imprisonment. It arrives disguised as improved safety management, better systems, more precautions, stricter protocols, cleaner boundaries. Historical accounts of Hugh's later years describe increasingly severe isolation. He spent extended periods secluded in hotel suites and controlled environments. Contact with others narrowed. Access became filtered. Ordinary interaction grew increasingly difficult. Not because the world itself had become objectively unmanageable, but because the threshold for what counted as safe had changed. This is the critical shift. Fear does not always require external escalation. It can escalate internally by redefining acceptable conditions. What was once tolerable becomes questionable. What was once manageable becomes risky. What was once normal becomes contaminated. This recalibration is rarely static. It moves. The standard tightens. The rules multiply. And because each new restriction appears to reduce immediate anxiety, the system interprets expansion of control as evidence of effectiveness. This is profoundly misleading. A person may feel temporarily safer while becoming objectively less free. Their world becomes more controlled, and simultaneously less livable. This is not contradiction. It is the mechanism. Safety-seeking can become so dominant that it begins consuming the very life it was originally designed to protect. Not through dramatic collapse, through progressive narrowing. A smaller environment, fewer variables, less contact, less uncertainty, less life. This is where avoidance reveals its most expensive cost. Not merely anxiety maintenance, identity erosion. A life once defined by movement can become organized around immobility. A person once capable of vast external reach may become increasingly governed by rituals, constraints, and invisible rules. Howard Hughes accumulated extraordinary power. Yet power proved structurally irrelevant against internal architecture organized around contamination threat. This contrast is psychologically important. External resources do not automatically produce internal freedom. Money cannot negotiate with conditioned fear. Status cannot exempt a nervous system from reinforcement loops. Influence cannot purchase extinction learning. If anything, resources can sometimes make avoidance easier to maintain. More control becomes available, more insulation possible, more environmental customization, more opportunities to avoid disconfirming contact. This can create a dangerous illusion. The system appears increasingly optimized. But optimization toward avoidance is still contraction, only better funded. This is why unchecked avoidance can become self-reinforcing at astonishing scale. The person does not merely avoid one trigger. They begin constructing an entire life architecture that minimizes perceived threat exposure. Schedules adapt. Relationships adapt. Environments adapt. Behavioral rules harden. Eventually, daily existence itself can begin orbiting around fear maintenance. Not consciously, operationally. This is how an internal alarm can become a governing principle large enough to reorganize a human life from the inside outward. If fear can reorganize a life by turning prediction into unquestioned reality, then the central problem becomes brutally clear. The anxious system is not primarily reacting to what is happening. It is reacting to what it expects will happen. And expectations, once reinforced long enough, can begin feeling indistinguishable from truth. This is the territory psychologist Edna Foa spent decades studying. Beginning in the 1970s and continuing through influential research on anxiety disorders and obsessive-compulsive disorder, FOA helped establish one of the most important clinical principles in modern behavioral treatment. Pathological fear weakens when expected catastrophe repeatedly fails to occur under conditions of exposure without escape. This sounds simple, almost offensively simple, but its implications are radical. A person with contamination fears touches what feels dangerous and does not wash. A person with obsessive doubt resists checking. A person with intrusive fears remains present without performing neutralizing rituals. A person with panic remains in bodily discomfort without immediate escape. The procedure is psychologically demanding for one reason. It violates the nervous system's existing operating rules. The system predicts danger. Exposure interrupts the escape sequence. And suddenly, the organism is forced into a confrontation it has been structurally avoiding. Prediction remains active. Threat anticipation surges. Urgency intensifies. Everything inside the person may scream for ritual, avoidance, control, or retreat. And yet the protocol requires remaining. Not because suffering itself is therapeutic, but because without interruption of avoidance, no new learning can occur. This is the central mechanism. Not reassurance, not positive thinking, not rational debate. Prediction must meet reality directly. Foa's research repeatedly demonstrated something that is deeply counterintuitive. Anxiety often rises before it falls. This matters because many people use anxiety reduction as the immediate criterion for whether they are doing something correctly. If distress increases, they conclude something is wrong, dangerous, unsustainable. But under exposure conditions, initial distress is not necessarily evidence of failure. It is often evidence that the learning system has been activated. Old predictions are colliding with new behavioral conditions. The organism expects catastrophe, but escape is withheld. This creates a temporary state of intense uncertainty. And uncertainty is profoundly uncomfortable. Yet within that discomfort, something clinically significant begins unfolding. Time passes. Predicted catastrophe does not occur, or occurs in a far less devastating form than expected. The feared consequences fail to materialize with the anticipated severity. This is where learning changes, not because the person was reassured, but because their own experience began generating contradictory data. I remained, nothing happened, or something happened, and I survived. This distinction is transformative. The nervous system no longer relies exclusively on inherited prediction. It begins incorporating observed reality. This is how fear networks start weakening. Not through verbal persuasion, through expectancy violation. The anticipated disaster loses credibility. This predictive authority degrades. The alarm becomes less convincing. Not immediately, not permanently after one trial, but progressively, with repetition, under conditions where escape no longer prevents contact between expectation and outcome. This is what avoidance has been interrupting all along. This is the deeper implication of Foa's work. Fear is not merely an emotion to be suppressed. It is a predictive model, a system generating future-oriented threat simulations. And like any predictive model, it updates through error correction. If the brain predicts catastrophe and catastrophe repeatedly occurs, the model strengthens. But if catastrophe is repeatedly predicted and repeatedly fails to occur, tension emerges. The model is forced to confront mismatch. This mismatch is not comfortable. It destabilizes prior certainty. It introduces ambiguity where confidence once existed. But it is precisely this disruption that makes change possible. The brain begins revising probabilities. Perhaps contamination is not always lethal. Perhaps uncertainty is survivable. Perhaps intrusive thoughts are not dangerous commands. Perhaps bodily sensations are not emergency signals. These revisions are not philosophical. They are procedural, embodied, learned through repeated contact with disconfirming reality. This is why avoidance is so costly. It protects prediction from correction. It shields the model from error. And an unchallenged predictive system can remain intact for years while continuing to generate fear as if its assumptions were unquestionably accurate. Exposure reverses this, not by arguing with fear, by exposing it to falsification. The person becomes a participant in an experiment their own nervous system has been avoiding. And gradually, what once felt inevitable begins losing its status as truth. There is a hidden cost to obeying fear that goes beyond anxiety, missed opportunities, or visible retreat. It alters self-perception. Every avoided conversation, delayed decision, unsent message, abandoned confrontation, or escaped discomfort communicates something quietly but repeatedly to the mind. Not merely, "That was dangerous," but something more corrosive. "I am someone who cannot handle this." This is how avoidance begins rewriting identity. Not through grand declarations, through microevidence. Behavior becomes autobiography. Action becomes self-definition. A person does not need to consciously decide they are weak, incapable, fragile, socially inadequate, or emotionally unprepared. Repeated avoidance can construct those conclusions automatically. The mind watches the body escape and draws inference. If I keep leaving, there must be a reason. If I keep postponing, perhaps I am not built for this. If I keep avoiding discomfort, maybe discomfort contains something I cannot survive. This is one of fear's most destructive side effects. It does not merely distort perception of the external world. It gradually distorts perception of the self. The tragedy is subtle. A person may begin life with ambition, curiosity, appetite for growth, and willingness to experiment. But over years of reinforced avoidance, they can slowly become a historian of their own retreats, a collector of unfinished movements, a witness to repeated self-interruption. And eventually, the greatest fear is no longer the external event. It is contact with the accumulating evidence of who one appears to be becoming. This is why many people misdiagnose the source of their suffering. They believe their pain comes from fear itself. But often, fear is only the spark. The chronic suffering comes from fragmentation, from becoming divided against oneself. One part wants expansion, movement, risk, connection, expression. Another part demands retreat, control, delay, containment, safety. And because both systems feel persuasive, the person becomes psychologically split, pulled between incompatible imperatives. Advance, withdraw, speak, stay silent, act, wait, reach, hide. This internal conflict is exhausting in a way pure fear is not. Fear is acute. Conflict is chronic. It drains attention, consumes cognitive bandwidth, corrodes decisiveness, creates a life filled with partially initiated actions and incomplete commitments. This fragmentation often produces a specific kind of fatigue, not physical exhaustion, existential depletion, the tiredness of constant internal negotiation. Should I do it? Should I leave? Should I wait? Should I avoid it? Should I finally face it? This repeated internal debate can become more psychologically expensive than the feared event itself. And over time, a person may become less afraid of discomfort than exhausted by their own hesitation. Not because the danger disappeared, but because self-division became intolerable. At some point, the cost of remaining split begins exceeding the cost of contact with reality. There is another illusion hidden inside avoidance. The belief that life will begin once fear disappears, once confidence arrives, once certainty is available, once discomfort no longer dominates the body. But this bargain is structurally impossible. Life does not wait behind the elimination of fear. It unfolds in parallel with it. Meaning is not granted after emotional conditions become ideal. It is built under imperfect conditions, while uncertain, while activated, while not fully ready. This is deeply offensive to the part of the mind that wants guarantees. because guarantees feel clean, controlled, negotiable, but existence does not offer advance reassurance. No contract is signed before action. No authority arrives to certify readiness. No internal bell rings announcing that all discomfort has been resolved. Many people spend years unconsciously negotiating for a version of reality that does not exist. A future in which movement will feel naturally safe. A day when risk will no longer feel like risk. A version of self untouched by hesitation. That day does not arrive, not because something is wrong, but because the condition itself is false. Readiness is often not a prerequisite for action. It is a byproduct of repeated action under incomplete certainty. This means something psychologically brutal. Much of life is inaccessible to those waiting for emotional permission.